Welcome to Regulate Tech. This is our 25th episode with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and...
with me, Richard Allan.
So, Richard, I read in the news this week that Google and Microsoft have refused to renew the truce that they had on the policy and lobbying area. I thought that was really interesting. I thought you had said something interesting too that led me to believe that it might be a good opportunity for us to discuss how do you work with other companies if you're in public policy? How do you work with other actors overall? Because it's not a two-person game, is it?
It certainly isn't, and you know most of the issues that you share in a sector tend to be common issues, and yet sort of tech companies, and we've both experienced this, we've sort of ended up repeatedly, at odds with each other, and often very publicly. And certainly you and I both, remember the times in Brussels where I think a lot of the trade associations that were supposed to represent the entire tech sector, they were either known as a Google Trade Association or a Microsoft Trade Association. They couldn't be both. It was, it's ridiculous that we were so divided. And I do think that actually, there is an interesting comparison with other industries where I think that, it's maybe my impression, people in those other industries may be listening to this and tell me this is all wrong. But the impression you get is that they present much more of a united front to policymakers. And I certainly have had that echoed back to me from politicians to say, I don't know what the hell you guys in the internet sector want, because everybody who comes through my door is asking for a different thing and telling me that the other guys are terrible. And yet when the car industry comes through my door, the car industry says, this is what the car industry needs, or the banking industry says, this is what the banking industry needs, and yet somehow in tech, we're often, splitting hairs, but we end up managing to present this very disunited front.
Is it a maturity issue, you think, that we are still a young industry? The tech industry is a young industry, and there's a lot of competition, a very clear-cut sort of incumbent gets unseated by new entrant dynamic to technology that might not exist as clearly in the car industry. The underlying technology changes so fast that you get this incumbent new entrant dynamic that I wonder if you have in say pharma, where all of the innovation is outsourced to the edges of the network and then licensed or acquired when it becomes interesting enough.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think we can probably, and we should explore cutting it in sort of various different ways to try and understand these dynamics. And one certainly is an incumbent challenger model. And again, we talked about, Brussels just now and Microsoft and Google shops. But when you looked at the telecom sector, they had separate trade associations for the incumbent telecoms operators and the challenger ones. And both of them sort of presented themselves as telecoms trade associations, but everybody knew this one's the challengers and this one's the incumbents. And so there's definitely something there, I think, where you're the new kid on the block and you're sort of like super aggressive, then you are in a different mode, I think, from somebody who's trying to sort of cling on sometimes actually to a declining market share. You're trying to shore up the defenses around a particular sector, and you've got some enemy who's far off, maybe a altogether different breed of organization. I mean, again, interestingly, the thing that would often bring the telecoms companies together, whether they were incumbents or challengers, was the threat of guys like us in the internet sector. So they would, that would sort of pull them all together and make them much more united. So before we came along, they felt safe bashing each other. We come along and now it's, we must defend SMS against all of these, internet private messaging services. So they start to take a united view against us. So I think there are various sort of dynamics going on. And part of it as well may just be this, the internet companies do, and I'll say this sort of with a smile, they do have a little bit of world domination in their DNA, in that, we talk a lot about this, when you go on the internet, you can sort of access the entire world, you can get users from all over the world. And there is, most internet companies, if you ask them, scratch the surface, they go, yeah, I would like everybody in the world to use my service. Whereas a lot of other industries, you sort of are playing to a smaller, more defined market. Your growth potential is limited, whereas internet companies think that their growth potential is infinite. And maybe that also affects them.
Yeah. And again, you get into this the nature of the market. There are many people who would argue that technology markets are much more winner take all markets than many other markets are. But I don't think that's entirely true. But I do think that even the perception that this is true could actually create a very strange dynamic. But I want to explore the new entrant incumbent thing a little bit more by just sort of giving a historical background. And think about this, right? Microsoft, when they came along, they were the young upstart against IBM. And they really, they spoke about being the young upstart. They talked about Big Blue being slow and not able to sort of come with the times. This was everyone should have a PC, whereas they thought that just a few people had need for or should have access to computers. And then suddenly Microsoft grows, and they grow really, really fast, which is another component of this, I think, the sort of the fast growth trajectories. And what happens, it ends up in this fantastic battle with Apple that I think has to be one of the most epic competitor battles that we've seen, the one between Microsoft and Apple, with all of the ads where there was PC and Mac guy, and they were just brilliant. They were brilliant. For those of you who haven't seen them, they're all available on YouTube, but they show you exactly what a new entrant incumbent tension looks like, with the new kid on the block. In this case, the Apple guy is young and exuberant and with it and hip, and PC is played by this sad, slightly overweight office guy who is sort of always getting into trouble with his technology. And there is something there again, the fast, slow tension that exists. And then Apple stumbles. And it really stumbles, and Steve Jobs leaves, and all of that, that entire story is well known. And so what happens is that Google starts to fill the role that Apple filled previously, and Google becomes the challenger, and you do things in the cloud, and it's the internet. And Google has in turn followed on Netscape, that also was one of the challengers that said, you don't need an operating system, and Sun Microsystems saying that the network is the computer. And there's this sort of tension again, and then Google, of course, grows very successful and is now challenged by companies, first actually by companies like Facebook, but today also challenged by any number of new entrants into sort of the information discovery market. There's a ton of competition here to be a sector where people say that there's no competition actually happening, but it happens between new entrants and incumbents in a way where you have almost punctuated equilibria oriented around a single incumbent that's then unseated by either a change in technology, which seems to be the most usual one, or by a change in the use of technology, that you start using the same technology completely differently.
Exactly. And I think that it is that competition that I think perhaps is at the heart of the fact that companies don't get together on the policy themes. In fact, say quite the opposite. They end up sort of going out and briefing against each other. And I certainly remember, I was out at Facebook when Google came up with its social networking product, which was Google Plus. Remember?
Oh God!
No, there were various incarnations, but and now people.
We had Orkut as well. Orkut, Google Plus,
and people sort of look at this now, and it seems to them like obvious that Facebook was going to win somehow. You use the phrase 2020 hindsight. It's obvious that Facebook was going to win, and Google was never a real threat. But actually, when you were sitting inside Facebook, Google did feel like a real threat. They were going to come and take our social networking lunch. They were going to stick their social networking app on the front page of every Android phone that they sold, and they were going to squeeze Facebook off of those Android phones. That was the view inside Facebook. And I'm sure Google similarly kind of went, Facebook's building in search, and they're going to, steal our lunch because they're going to have people doing search and discovery through Facebook instead of coming to the Google search engine. And so inside the companies, it does feel like there's a real existential threat coming from this other company. And I think that's ultimately then what leads to you thinking, well, what are your angles of leverage? How are you going to win? Obviously, you're going to compete on technology, but one of the other classic areas where companies compete is around policy. And so you do start going in, and I bet we were briefing against each other. I was going in and explaining how dangerous Google was going to be. And I think I saw the slide decks from Google where Google was going in explaining how Facebook was hoovering up all of the ad market. So you end up in that, counter briefing position.
Yeah, and there's this really interesting concrete example that I think won't be revealing too much to sort of dig into, which is the notion of data portability, where we had an early conflict between Facebook and Google, where sort of the general feeling from Google was that Facebook was hovering up contacts data and using it to feed its own network growth, and there was a tiff, and then Google established something called the reciprocity principle, which said if you do not have open APIs, we're not going to have open APIs with you. And at that point, we also decided or Google decided to invest in data portability in a big way and make sure that you could take everything you wanted out of Google. And I remember distinctly having this discussion with people and say, well, Facebook don't have a data portability service at all. And then you came up with something that was quite horrible. It's just a flat file. And I remember these tensions, and it was so interesting because I don't think we accomplished anything by doing that. I don't think there was any winner or loser in the data portability battle. But still, I remember that being a talking point that sort of came back to differentiate between what should have been joint interests instead if we had sat down and talked about it. But that doesn't seem to happen. It's obvious that data portability is a good response for the industry now, I think, and that it helps the industry as a whole. But at that point, it was you would seize all opportunity to find distinctions.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you talk about that example. How many of the things that tech companies do that you put it out there and you say this is a good thing, like data portability, and yet on the other side there may be another company who perceives it actually as quite a hostile, aggressive act. And the example that we're all living through at the moment, if people are following it, is around Apple's privacy settings, where Apple is putting out settings which certainly do make data more private, but the response from some of the other tech companies has been, whoa, hang on a minute, you're just doing that to kind of try and drive us out of business. And similarly with Google Chrome, I think, again, there's a debate going on there. And so when you unpick it, I suspect it's some of both, isn't it? You come up with something which is a good thing to do, and it happens to align with your business interest by sort of embarrassing or damaging the interests of one of your competitor companies. And that seems to be, I say, a repeated pattern. So again, I think I don't think it's too cynical or skeptical to kind of say, well, okay, company X has just gone out with a big fanfare and said, we've got what was the Google's one called the Data Liberation Front, was it? Something like that.
Yes,
we've got this.
Yes.
It's going to be branded as this like super wonderful tool, Data Liberation Front. You can both think that's a really good thing, and you can go, aha, that's also, a thing where they're trying to have a poke at their competitor, and that's going to upset the competitor. And back to where we started, it's going to be really hard for those two companies to go and present a common view to the regulator or policymakers on something where one company is trying to poke their fingers in the eye of the other.
Yes, but and it's interesting because that was one argument that we often encountered, wasn't it? I mean, if we came up with something like data portability, or I mean, if Google came up with something like that, then the others would say, "Oh, you can't release it because we haven't talked about it." But if you were to go to talk about it, it would just die in endless discussions because the companies couldn't agree. So at the heart of this is also an inability or an unwillingness to do something that's not invented here. Yeah. It's like you find this in the child sexual abuse imagery debate as well, where there are a gazillion different ways of detecting these images, but no single industry standard, which is weird because an industry standard could be much more powerful. You have photo DNA from Microsoft, for example. You have the hashing technology that Facebook and Google engages with, but there's sort of no push to sort of build that single. Not that's unfair. There is some of a sort of standardization tendency there, to be honest. But I think there's no broad industry umbrella organization saying this is how we'll do it, and we'll make sure that everyone who has some kind of content platform has access to this. Microsoft smartly did this with Photo DNA. They licensed that freely to others and let that out into the market. But they've always been smarter about standards because they sell so much to the public sector. Yeah. I mean, consumer tech companies compete in a very different way than business to government companies do, I think.
Yeah, and there's an interesting example because you're right. I mean, some of it again is in the engineering culture and the what we call hacker culture that people who are very, very, very good software engineers in a company will generally, with some often quite good reason, think that they can find a better way to do something than others. And actually, that's how these solutions get developed and improved upon. So you're right. And that then acts as a sort of impediment to everybody doing the same thing. It may be more that the smaller companies are more prepared to take an off-the-shelf solution. The larger ones almost invariably want to build their own. But there's also in there something which, again, you and I share this experience that I'm sure we both have, which is, once you start talking about deploying the same technologies, you then actually hit the other side of antitrust law, which is, am I going into a red zone here? So if we, shared content moderation technology, is that a sort of cartel-like operation? So the open standard is fine. Once you put it out in the open domain so that everyone can use it, that's great. But I certainly remember having conversations where you had to be very careful for good legal reasons that you weren't going to give you and the other company or the other small group of companies a competitive edge because you were only sharing something with yourselves, and that meant that each of you would have some kind of advantage in the marketplace. So sometimes they say you can have a will to try and do things together, but you've got to be very, very careful from a legal point of view. And again, that's not a negative. That's not like we don't do this. You cry competition law. It's a genuine issue, which is there is a line you can cross where you're cooperating in a way which is unfair to other people in the market.
Yeah, and I remember several meetings about these kinds of standards where you had to sign a document at the beginning, sort of openly documenting that this was not in order to in any way distort markets, et cetera, et cetera. And it was about really important, simple content moderation technologies that would help everyone in the industry. And I do think, to my mind, it's sort of a situation where there's a tragedy of the commons because everyone is so smart that they want to pursue their own solution, and instead of looking at what the mean could be, we're all trying to optimize, and in that optimization we're also seeking distinction. The other kind of meeting that I'm sure that you often also ended up in was the strategy meeting, where the discussion. I will exaggerate slightly, but the discussion was, how can we make sure that we break free from the GAFA, that we're not part of the GAFA anymore? We should sort of have it be the GAFA.
The GAFA?
The GAFA is Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, sometimes with an M at the end, so as in Microsoft, but they niftily managed to sort of be the older generation company and not be involved in it as much as the rest of us were. And it was an enormous amount of energy went into thinking about how can you distinguish yourself from the rest of the sector that you're being bundled with. And I now think that was a mistake. I think if you look at sort of what the narrative is, what the discourse is, there's no way that you can suddenly not be big tech anymore.
Yeah.
If you're one of the companies originally identified with big tech. But it's interesting to me because I think we were all very well intentioned and we really wanted to sort of showcase that the company we worked for was different and didn't do all of these horrible things that some of the other companies did. And I think it's a peculiar kind of groupthink that you end up in, a sort of tribal mindset where you want to defend what you believe in and what you've decided to ultimately devote your time to. I don't know. The mechanism there is fascinating because the obvious answer would be to say, okay, if we're all bundled together, let's start to act as if we're a single united group and make really smart moves in order to dispel people's concern with the sector as it grows.
Yeah. And it isn't, the messaging, you're absolutely right, would be, each of us trotting into potentially a policymaker's office going, here is why we are different and special and better than the others.
And I love the fact that the policymakers, they picked up on this and they were super smart. You got into a politician and say, I don't have a problem with you, really. I only have a problem with Facebook. Yeah. Like you talk to a German politician about the German Nets, the sort of
Network Enforcement Act.
Yes, the Network Enforcement Act. They would say, it's only because of Facebook. That's, it's roughly, if Facebook just had their act together, it wouldn't be a problem. And I'm sure that when you talked to them, they said the opposite and said that it was only about Google.
Oh, no, they said it was only about Facebook. Just on that one. It really was only about Facebook. Yeah.
Well, that one might have been right.
But
otherwise, I think
proves the rule, yes. But then you would also, it reminded me, you get these instances again where you say you're all trying to be sort of different and better than the others all the time and explain how you're different. And some politicians would just say, pick up on that and go, but you're not, you're just the same as the others. Some of them wouldn't even be so polite about it. But I say in some instances you genuinely are being targeted. And then you get the other syndrome, which I'm sure you had, which is, God damn it. Those people at Facebook are so terrible at dealing with X, hate speech. We're being dragged into this thing. And I often felt Microsoft were in that position a lot of the time because they don't really have much user-generated content stuff. And yet they would sort of get dragged into debates that were really driven by YouTube and Facebook because they're about user-generated content. So there's that, God, why am I wasting time on this thing? Because those guys down the road can't get their act together.
They would always have to turn up at these meetings, for example, with the counterterrorism task force, etc. And they would always grudgingly turn up because they also had to, given all of their government sales. They couldn't afford to be seen as not cooperating with these initiatives. But they were always very... one of the few times I ever saw them flinch was when somebody noted that Xbox was being used for nefarious purposes. And they reminded themselves that they had this enormous network of gamers that they have, I think, probably not necessarily thought of as a part of their core policy work.
and there would be those moments when we're sort of intensely focused on search as a problem and people searching, for example, for terrorist content being returned, and the Google people would be on the spot. And then someone would go, and Bing, and they would go, and Bing, and then move on. It wouldn't stop. Yeah.
Yes, and you're forced, if you're the Microsoft representative, you have to look up and look appreciative and nod, and sort of then it all goes on. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
We are an important part of this conversation. Sorry, this is we're having too much fun with this.
Yes, we are. Well, we should back up. So let's back up a little bit. I think one of the insights that comes to you as you work with public policy long enough is that it is very rarely the case that you end up in a situation where you have a political problem that originated with politicians. It's much more often the case that you have a political problem that originated with your competitors talking to a politician about you. And so the way I used to think about this is to say that, public policy is not a two-person game. It's an n-person game with a ton of different actors who are all out to set a story and to set you in a story. And so you end up essentially playing to all of those other stories, trying to craft your own story in the midst of it. And I think that your point about other industries is really interesting here, because to the extent that industry can start to have a more cohesive story and start trusting each other, it seems to me that they would have an enormous advantage when they talk to decision makers of different kinds, wouldn't they?
I think they would, and you're right. When we say others causing trouble, it actually does remind me again. I think one of the reasons why Facebook was always so much in the frame, and actually Google to a large degree, so Facebook and Google in particular, were that it wasn't just competitors inside the tech industry, but frequently it was competitors in other sectors, notably the media sector, who have an incredibly sort of powerful voice.
And
the telcos, so you get it from all sides. The telcos are going, you've stolen our SMS revenue. We don't like that. And the media companies, newspapers and broadcasters are saying you're stealing our advertising revenue. and they're all going in and briefing governments against you quite aggressively. And you have to say, look, we did have sort of homegrown issues, but had there not been all of that noise around them, would the atmosphere have been anything like as aggressive? And I think the answer is no. You would have been having a conversation with a politician about stuff that does matter to them, but they wouldn't have, just come from a series of meetings with other people saying that you're destroying the national economy, or they wouldn't have been fresh from reading a newspaper in the morning where, the latest scandal related to Facebook or Google content was on page 1, page 6, page 12. I remember sometimes you pick it up and even get into the sports pages, you just get all the way through the newspaper. There'd be like 8 different references. And again, they were reporting on things that people cared about, but at the same time, they were doing it as competitors, they had a very strong vested interest in reporting against companies that they themselves said were stealing their revenue as far as they saw it. So yes.
Yeah. So I remember one of the things that I was involved with, and I think you were surely too, were these peace brokering missions where you would try to meet with a publisher or with a telco, and you would sort of sit down with them and you would try to talk through what can we do to actually stop fighting each other. Much like Google brokered peace with Microsoft after a series of really, really bad years that I think turned out to the detriment of much of the tech industry, frankly. And I sat down with a large European telco that should remain unnamed, and their story, and this is pretty well known by now, and it's a recurring story, was that they just wanted a level playing field, and they wanted to make sure that the over-the-top companies were subject to all of the regulations that they were subject to, and that they had to pay all of the taxes that they had to pay, and they just wanted this level playing field. And I remember asking them, I mean, I sort of get that, but why do you always want to level up? Why do you always want sort of everyone to be under the same regulation when we could be, a part of a group saying that, well, maybe telcos need to have a bit, relaxed or liberalized regulation or reformed regulation for the future in order to really develop. And they looked very, they were very confused. They looked at me and said, no, you don't see. I mean, this inflicts a lot of pain on us, but that pain will be much worse for you because we have known this pain for so long. And that mentality surprised me. And I think it was eye-opening to someone who has always thought that companies are rational profit maximizers, and they're not. they're sort of in these situations where you get into almost tribal enmity. The reality is a sub-optimization for everyone, not just sort of for the individual companies involved, but also for the regulators who have to deal with a ton of incoming, and for the consumers who get worse services, I think.
Yeah. So I think you're right that there is that, we want to inflict pain on you, but I think it actually may be a little bit more rational, which is the notion that, and while those guys are kind of roiling with the pain and the trouble of the new regulation, maybe, just maybe, we can sort of try and regain some of our mojo and get ahead again. So I think some of it is more rational. And we saw it on the media side where media companies would argue and say, the level playing field means social media should be regulated as publishers, which kind of is a nonsense at one level, because it is completely different if you've commissioned some content and put it out in your publication in your name versus if you've simply got an open platform where other people can post their content. I mean, these are apples and pears. They're not the same thing. And I think a lot of media company people knew that. But arguing for it, I think, is just a lifeline. And suddenly, if we can create this doubt around social media companies where they all have to be super cautious and not allow their platforms to be open, then that is just relatively going to allow us to kind of get back into the game. I don't think it's for the public good, but I can kind of see as a business why you might do that. It's, hobble your competitor in the hope that will give you a chance to move ahead.
Slow them down and create friction, barnacles on the ship, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's, from a regulator point of view, it doesn't make any sense at all. I use the example sometimes, I think it's relevant here, of planes, trains and automobiles. I can, sitting in London, I could, if I wanted to go to Edinburgh in Scotland, I could drive, I could fly, I could take a train, and they would all actually do functionally the same thing, and they would get me there pretty much a similar amount of time, end-to-end journey. But the three modes of transport are regulated very differently from each other because they have very different qualities. And, the safety legislation of a plane is at the highest level, then trains somewhere in between, and then cars. The idea that you would regulate a car like you'd regulate a plane, where when you get in your car in the morning, somebody has to come and give you a safety briefing, and you've got to kind of have an oxygen mask that falls from the roof, all of that kind of stuff. Like, of course, we see that as a nonsense. A lot of the level playing field stuff is basically saying, well, we're a plane, we're an airline, this is how we're regulated, so you should regulate the cars the same as us because they do the same thing. Well, no, they do the same thing, but they shouldn't have the same regulation. But anyway, rant over.
Good rant.
Made the point. Yeah.
and let's take it back. So the technology industry has had a problem with division in their ranks. it's an old problem. It's Microsoft versus Big Blue of the IBM. It's Apple versus Microsoft, and it comes probably partly from the speed with which the industry develops and this phenomenon of an incumbent and a new entrant coming very close in time up on each other. But now the industry is arguably slowing down, and it's becoming much more regulated. And it will have to turn the regulation into compliance. And that compliance seems to me to be something that would open up a much more industry-focused, industry-centric form of collaboration between the companies. What are you, sort of extrapolating from that, what do you think the world will look like in 5 years? Do you still think you will have the tech companies briefing against each other now that Microsoft and Google have decided not to renew their Truce?
No, I think it's different. This speed question that you've pulled out, I think, is critical. So again, if we look at the car sector, the traditional car manufacturers are worried about a Tesla, but they're not worried that Tesla is going to take all of their customers next year. It's that Tesla might, steal 3% of their market share over 5 or 10 years from each of them, because there's no way that everybody who buys a General Motors car this year could buy a Tesla next year. In the internet sector, the fear has been exactly that. Essentially that everyone is going to go from General Motors to Tesla next year. They're all going to go from, Facebook to Google or Apple in a very short space of time. And so that's what I think has really driven this sort of urge to fight each other. I think you're right. If the market settles down, if now what we're talking about is we're worried that, TikTok may take 3% of our market share, or that YouTube may take 4%, or whatever it is between the companies, then you're much more like the car industry. You're much more sort of worried at the margins, and there's much less urgency, I think, to go after each other as hard. You can still be annoyed that you're losing market share, but it's not existential. It's sort of at the margins. And so I think in that world, if, form will follow fact, as it were. If the fact is that we are settling down into a market where, the major apps and platforms have got a pretty strong market share that they're going to continue for the long term, and they feel like they're going to continue holding those market shares for the long term, then, approximately those market shares, then I think we're much more likely to see a world in which they do start to work with each other. And I think you're right, some of the regulatory frameworks that are being proposed create the environment for that. So, for example, we talked about standards earlier. Under this online safety bill in the UK, we talked about before, they talk about lots and lots of secondary regulation, which are very detailed sets of guidance notes. So if there's a set of guidance notes that says this is how you should deal with child exploitation material, it may well go into the detail of it. These are the kind of tools you should use. These are how you should use them. And then you would be much more likely to have the industry come together around that code and essentially agree a common way of doing things. And they're not going to try and, compete with each other on how well they deal with those things. That they're all going to be settled into a common framework where they're going to implement the same measures. And again, arguably, vehicle safety standards are similar to that.
I think that's really interesting, because it also suggests that there is a huge task ahead for those companies that are now being regulated, and that is to establish as much as possible the granularity of those industry standards and the richness of them, so that those industry standards become the place for regulatory change. So you don't have to go back to the underlying law, but you can actually, if the world changes, you can change the standards, and new standards can be updated and negotiated within the industry, which gives you flexibility and arguably adaptability to changing ways of using the technology. So one of the tricks you can't miss if you're in this sector today is digging deep into standardization, which is funnily enough, I think, one of the areas where many of the tech companies has performed really, really badly. But that now seems to be a core strength, right?
Yeah, we'd have to. I mean, I remember as an example, there was an EU code of practice on disinformation, which we've talked about before, and the European Commission at one point said, we want metrics. I think they still want them. We want key performance indicators. Here's the data we want from all of you. around political advertising, for example. But each company does that differently. There is no standard. They all collect the data differently. Their systems are structured differently. I think you're right. What the regulatory framework would do, once you move that to a regulated model, it will have to define what a political advert is, what the data points are that you need to collect around a political advert, and then everybody will have to implement that together. And we talked about that in industry. We've talked lots of areas about having these common standards, never quite got there. And I think the external force of a regulator, well, by law, it is going to require the companies to kind of implement the standard, and therefore the company's own interest, as you say, is in getting together and working on the standard rather than just sort of sitting back or, say, like in the old world, going into the regulator and each of them proposing to the regulator that there's a different standard. And then it's sort of potluck, whichever one the regulator chooses. Obviously, as an industry, you're in a much better position to sort of do the pre-work and then work collectively with the regulator for a standard that everybody can implement. But the key difference is that there will be a regulator forcing that conversation, as opposed to just leaving it to the industry to have a multilateral conversation, which in most cases has not worked for all these reasons that we've discussed.
And, when you read that Microsoft, there was an article recently in Axios, are now on a hiring spree for government officials or the public policy people. And they want to sort of hire as many people as possible. I think that's a good signal because they've always been, I think, among the best when it comes to standards and understanding the importance of standards, partly because of their background, again, in business to business and business to government, where standards are absolutely essential for public procurement, for example. And I think that the way that these standards shape up could have some small competitive effects in the beginning. But if everyone chimes in and really digs into how these standards are shaped, I think they can be uniformly good for the entire industry. And it's a huge piece of work, though, because standardization is not simple.
No.
But I want to get back to, so I think this notion of speed, that there's a stabilization of the internet economy, at least for the first wave, for the sort of consumer tech internet economy, where, the time to extinction used to be really short. Think Friendster, think MySpace, think Alta Vista, and you could be extinct within, as you pointed out, a year or so, and you could really disappear. That's no longer the case. I mean, what you see now is the kind of stability that allows, if you look at it from biological terms, it's kind of stability that allows a phyla to diversify slowly and introduce new species and new variations of evolutionary solutions to hard problems. But what will happen now is that the amount of species will increase, not that they will be displacing or substituting each other. So it's interesting because you'll have more and more of these companies, and they will certainly, at the edges, I think they will gain market share, but you should not expect any one of them to disappear. That's another argument, I think, for collaborating more. Because when you were back in the day where you actually thought that extinction was a real possibility, why would you form those long-term collaborative relationships with other companies if you thought that they either wanted to get you off the map or that they themselves could fall off? I think the reality is that for the tech companies today, they should expect that their competitors will be around for as long as they will.
Yes.
And that creates an entirely different game plan, I think.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And once some of these issues, some of the sort of outstanding issues are settled where you might have sought an advantage, then and you're all playing, the same game. And again, once some of the barriers have been, put in place to an extent that protects all of the incumbents from challenges. And, we've again talked about that. I think that is the reality of a more regulated environment. We talk about it's much harder to get into pharma or get into car making because the regulatory standards require a certain level of investment. I think once you're settled into that world, it's a very different environment from the one that we've been in. Ironically, the one of the biggest threats that now comes, as we saw in the news last week, is that there is quite a strong political drive in a number of countries, notably in the new US administration, to break up the companies, which to say in an ironic way could kind of get us back to where we were before if it were to happen, where companies are feeling existential threats again and start behaving as though they're under existential threat. And we'll see. There was a court case that was out last week, which was taken as a sort of a blow against the move to break up, in this case, Facebook. It criticised the grounds under which the court case had been taken. But the response has been even more political will. There being even more political will to kind of change the legislation so that attempts at breakup might be more successful in future. So we'll see. But again, it's one of those dynamics in this competition space where sometimes one set of public policy objectives conflicts with another. The objective to have a sort of calm, orderly, well-regulated space, high standards on child protection, safety, privacy, etc., may end up being in conflict with another public policy objective, which is, cut these guys down to size. And at some point, they're going to have to reconcile.
And you could ask the question if that is really going to work. If you look at sort of the attempts to cut the telco industry up, it reconsolidated after a couple of years, and now you have a fair amount of concentration, at least in the US telco market. And I think that is likely to happen with other industries that share some of those network characteristics. And I'm sort of mystified by this focus on breaking large companies up, because I think it's much more interesting to talk about what kinds of standards of interoperability, et cetera, exist between different companies. And I think it's one of those things where we're being over-indexing on history. We're talking about trust busters and breaking things up, etc. We're not looking at recent history nor the nature of the technology that underlies these companies and how that will then, I think, lead to a reconsolidation if you actually do succeed in breaking these companies up. And so, but there's another interesting point here, and you mentioned competition. I think if you're in a future historian of the tech policy battles, one of the most interesting documents that you would want to have access to with your sort of FOIA request would be the kinds of contributions companies make to other companies' competition cases.
Oh, yeah.
I think that is one of the things where I think that an industry can harm itself the most by sort of, when they're contacted by a competition authority, or they're contacted by somebody who's in the competition investigation, and they're asked, so give us all of the horrors on this particular company. And some people choose to do so, some people choose not to do so, and send in an enormous amount of stuff on this other company, and feel very good about it because they feel that they've contributed to a more competitive environment. But what they also contributed to, of course, is some kind of retaliatory pattern. And that then goes on and on and on over time. I think that's something that when we write the story of the tech industry at some point, I think that will be one of the most interesting source documents will be the European Commission's consultation with other companies.
But of course, there is a workaround, which we can share because it's such an open secret that it's not a secret, which is that when you get invited to, submit to a competition authority why you think a company is terrible, like Google is terrible and there's locked up search, you don't actually submit it in your own name. What you do is you fund a much smaller company to submit it. And, that was certainly I forgot what the Fair Search, is it Fair Search? The thing that whole initiative, and everyone knows Microsoft was paying basically, I don't think that's libelous in any way, because it's well known Microsoft was sort of paying to support organizations. I think let's put it that way. And under the umbrella of those organizations, smaller companies were able to organize themselves to make complaints about Google. And so there is that, you're right. It's not only what's there on paper, but what's the sort of set of connections behind some of those submissions back to their originating parties that I think would be very interesting.
Yes, that will be very interesting. And one of the things that I think really did happen with the Microsoft Google Truce was that the industry stopped bashing each other for a while and started to think constructively about, again, how to develop institutions, how to develop standards, how to develop more mature behaviors really as an industry. And I'll without being privy to any special knowledge, I was really intrigued to see that this was not renewed. And to me, I think it is a sign that the cloud competition is heating up.
Yeah.
And that's something that's happening quite clearly. But I don't know what you think. What do you think? Why do you think that Google and Microsoft are not renewing their Truce?
I mean, maybe the cloud competition, but again, it may be back to this legal question that when you're talking to other companies, lawyers will come quite rightly again and make sure that you're not doing anything that breaches the letter or the spirit of the competition law. And it may well be that, given where they are both positioned in the market, so it could either be that the cloud competition is hotting up and they're trying to kill each other, or it could be that the cloud market is now so significant that for them to be collaborating starts to look cartel-like and therefore is problematic. And I could imagine lawyers sort of opining in either direction. So it could be they want to cooperate, but they're told they can't. Or it could be that they don't want to cooperate because they're now seeing each other as much more deadly enemies. And you're right, neither of us is privy to the insides, but those are my two hypotheses for the kind of conversation that might have taken place.
I mean, if you look at the pattern here, it's interesting because before they decided not to renew the truce, Microsoft came out quite publicly against Google and Facebook, I believe, in Australia, for example, in a way that very clearly aligned them with government interests, saying companies should not have opinions on what kinds of laws are adopted in the country. And I think the dynamic is going to continue to be really interesting with a company like Microsoft that is so dependent on public sector sales,
yes,
and has sort of a really powerful business model where a lot of governments are relying on them. And then these other companies that are going to fight against regulation, probably with both tooth and nail. And sort of it will be, I think that's possibly an area where we're wrong, where it won't stabilize, but it will actually heat up over the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating. The business dynamics matter, and yes, there are positions of principle, and I know that Microsoft policy team, have long-standing tradition of sort of deference to government, and they're very principled arguments. Brad Smith and others will articulate very good arguments why one should generally defer to government. They're good political arguments, but at the same time, policy positions generally align with business interests as well. So you're not going to get to be articulating the policy position for a company unless it is aligned reasonably closely with where the company itself wants to be. Facebook certainly have moved closer to that position and are more in the defer to government camp than I think they were previously. Not all governments, but certainly human rights respecting governments. I think there has been a shift there, and that may bring them a little bit closer to the Microsoft position as well. But out of all this conversation, I think the thing that you've come back to a few times, I'm finding maybe is the biggest potential for a new model is this talk about standards and the extent to which standards work. And so you can see something like interoperability or data portability is absolutely ripe for that, where you can compete like hell on your product offerings for something like an instant messaging service, and you can take different views on some aspects of it, but for the core questions for policymakers, things like encryption and data rest, data in transit, data being moved between different platforms, all of that could be subject to standards. There is that possibility. And in fact, that's one of the things that's certainly been holding back the interoperability of messaging services, is that there are no standards for things like encryption between different services as opposed to within a service. Just see how that goes.
And I think it's really interesting because if you go to, so standards is one of those things that I like to nerd out on. And I think one of the things that you can say about the internet overall as a technology is that it's probably the most successful example of humans creating de facto standards that work really, really well. The IETF is still an amazing phenomenon, horribly undervalued, horribly underrated. What they managed to do in order to sort of put together the internet standards that we communicate with. And also I think the W3C was just amazing, but that was outside of the existing standard system. It was sort of a de facto set of standards that did not belong in ISO or all of the UN standards associations. And we have this de jure standardization organization that has been, I think, really itching to get going on the internet, but that has unfortunately been controlled through different UN organizations, etc., by a lot of forces that are not entirely forces for good. So it will be really interesting to see this is the real next big battle, I think, if you're Google or if you're Facebook. It is laying out the standard space and understanding where you can build the institutions and standards that ensure continued growth, innovation, and freedom, and sort of not succumbing to those standards that are much more restrictive or even in some cases authoritarian, right?
Yeah, but your reference to de facto is exactly right, because we need to sometimes standards stare us in the face, but we don't recognize them. So there is a standard for data portability between social networking systems.
Yeah.
And that standard is the contacts book in Android and iOS for the contacts piece, and your Photos app again in Android and iOS. It is now trivial to take all of your contacts and all of your photos from one network to another, because when you install a new app, it says, please, can I slurp up all of your contacts and photo content? And you have this local copy that allows you to do that. So you don't need to go to Facebook to ask them for the data. You've got it on your phone and you send it off to the new thing. And so that's, again, raised a whole bunch of other questions, but it's really curious, again, to see that sometimes you're agonizing over something where you think you need a standard, you think it's a problem, and the technology sort of quietly gets on and solves it. And the solve in this case was the aggregation of pretty much the entire internet using population around two mobile phone operating systems, and then everybody else being able to code their apps just to work with those mobile phone operating systems. But they are the de facto standards.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And I think that in many cases, those de facto standards will probably benefit from being elevated to de jure standards in a good way, where they could enshrine a lot of the freedoms that they also contain, that these systems, the benefits that these systems give, rather than have a standards that just imposed from the outside. And I think this is such an interesting area also, because standards live long, right? The standards that you establish, they are going to be around for a long time. The HTML that you and I coded back in 1996 or 97 was not something that just came from outer space. It was an outgrowth of the SGML.
Yeah.
And, the kinds of work that had been done on markup languages and standardizing them that had gone on for years and years before you ended up having the web. And so the standards are generative. If they're run in the right way, they can preserve benefits and freedoms. They can institutionalize certain patterns of commerce and interaction that can really help an economy and help a society grow, I think. So to me, it's a little bit of I think this is a mind shift in many of the really big companies, because they've been able to create a standard just by putting something out there and not having to rely on the standards organization. I think if you're sort of looking at this from at least the perspective where I'm sitting, those standards organizations are going to be crucially important for the next 5-10 years in tech policy.
Absolutely right. And yes, they may be the trick or the so along with the regulation, it's the regulation and standard setting, I think, that ultimately are the forces that will bring companies together and make them sit down and work together, and as I say, present this united front, which is, from the start of our conversation, we certainly has not been the case in the internet sector to date.
No, and which I think we both agree would be enormously beneficial. Perhaps not earlier, perhaps those were the right decisions at the time, but the point in time that we are at now seems to suggest that collaboration beats briefing against each other by quite a large amount of benefits.
But we do have to, just as we close, rewrite history and acknowledge that it was always Google that started it, never Facebook's fault.
Yeah, right.
Is that what you said on your side?
Yes. Well, no, I'd like to say that, we had a principle of doing no evil whatsoever in the Google camp.
Yeah.
But then, these new guys came up, and what was their principle? It was move fast and break everything. And so you can just guess who you think is responsible for this.
I have to admit, Facebook got caught more often. So you read it in the press. But was it more wicked, or was it just more careless? I don't know.
I don't think we need an index of wickedness. If we do, I think there are other candidates for it as well.
Exactly. And all in the
Very good.
serving users.
Yes. So let's close on that note then. We believe collaboration and standards are the way forward from this point on, and that standards have been horribly underrated for a long time, actually.
Yes.
And this entire podcast can be found at your website, Richard. Is that right?
It is. It's at www.regulate.tech.
Perfect. And thank you, everyone, for listening, and we hope you tune in again next week.